Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star, with the last Mind Your Banner scouting special, at least of the regular season, and that obviously means Purdue, and that obviously means our good friend, our old friend through years, friend through tears, Nathan Baird. Nathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here, Zach. Thank you for having me on.
I know you are. Mind Your Banner scouting special is one of the legendary shows on this podcast since at least I think maybe Oregon Week, possibly even further back in this season than that. Iowa, I think, was the first one we did. So we've covered a lot of ground in a short space of time here at Mind Your Banners. I guess listen, the first question is the obvious question, which is just kind of where Purdue is sort of going into this game. I think to the naked eye, this seems like a tougher team than a year ago. It seems like a team that is, at least there's sort of a pathway to growth. I don't know if you disagree with me, but the results are still the results, and it is hard to kind of get away from that, especially at this point in the season, I would think.
Definitely a better team, I think, and not a better team in terms of talent, but a better team in terms of, I think, what you're talking about to some extent, the toughness. I think it's just a better coach team. This is really what I thought the season would probably look like, that the top end talent would not be as strong. They don't have Dylan Thienemans and Max Clairs and Will Heltz and those kinds of players necessarily on this roster. But just the structure and the accountability and the discipline, other than some penalty issues, have been there. And that has led to a more stable performance throughout the season. Where they messed up was they let two very gettable wins that they basically had and let slip away against Minnesota and Rutgers. If that was where they had a chance to change the perception of their season. And, who knows what happens on Friday, but if you get to the end of this thing with another loss, then it's 4-8 looks very different than 2-10. Finally winning Big Ten games again, finally beating power conference teams again. It looks very different than what it's going to look like if they lose on Friday. And for all of the improvements that they have made and for all of the stability that Barry Odom has brought to this, there is still just a tissue paper thin margin for error for this team. They really can't afford to make any mistakes. You can look at the Michigan game where if they make, they have Jack McAllister has been a very good punter all season. If he makes just one adequate punt before halftime, they might pull off one of the biggest upsets in the Big Ten this year. Instead, that's just another loss and one that slipped away. It's been that thin of a margin for error for this team. And it is about, I have thought all along that Barry Odom, from the day he was hired, was like, there's no such thing as a rebuild. We have to win right away. And that's how competitors and coaches and athletes have to talk. The rest of us who can take the 10,000-foot view, I think, looked at this from the beginning as this was a rock bottom situation by the end of last season, as everybody who was at that game or watched it in Bloomington last year saw. And they had a long way to go. And I thought this season all along was more about establishing a culture and establishing a foothold for what can come next, and especially what can they do in the transfer portal to further raise the level of talent at basically every position group on the field. That's what I always thought 2025 was going to be about. And I think there are signs that the first part of that happened. I think the future of this program is going to be, what do they do in the transfer portal this winter to enhance talent? Because at the end of the day, that's why that margin for error is so small. They just don't have enough big play talented people to make up for even sometimes the slightest mistakes.
I guess and this is sort of a philosophical question that's not necessarily related to the game Friday, but I'm just curious for your thoughts on where you think Barry Odom can intersect that culture with trying to flip a roster essentially fairly quickly. Obviously, I think there's been a lot of sort of armchair analysis of everyone trying to repeat what Curt Cignetti's done. But I think probably the biggest area, maybe even more so than talent, where Cignetti benefited from all of the institutional knowledge that he brought with him, players and coaches, from James Madison, was that from day one, what made Cignetti's process work at James Madison was in the door. Sorry, there's dogs barking in the background. Was in the door in Bloomington, and there was a lot he didn't have to do, essentially, right? Like there was a lot that was already done, even if everyone was in a new facility, a new stadium, new offices, new locker room. The ideas, the fundamental sort of cultural, I mean, this is kind of a high-minded phrase, but cultural values were very solid. How do you see Barry Odom? How have you seen Barry Odom go about trying to get that into his program while also trying to kind of move very quickly through turning over a roster? And as you talk about, probably having to be even more sort of decisive and successful with it this winter.
Well, I think what we've seen is that intersection only goes so far. I think that there also has to be talent. You also have to have some benefit from the schedule, which Purdue has not had now for 2 seasons. They've had pretty tough schedules here in both of these seasons. This November, after coming out of that stretch where they lost to Rutgers and Minnesota and then had a bad loss to Northwestern in the middle of that. But then their next 4 games are Michigan, Ohio State, Washington, and in this IU game. And there aren't going to be teams in the country that have a tougher finish than that. So from that standpoint, like building momentum this season hasn't necessarily worked in their favor. What I have seen is that there's been accountability. There's been players that we thought early this season were going to be important parts of this team and looked like the performance was there on the field. And when they didn't live up to expectations in other ways, suddenly they're not on the field anymore. And I think those things are important in a year like this to sort of set the expectations for what's going to come after it. I do think that, Barry Odom benefited from some of the same things that Curt Cignetti did as far as he brought his defensive coordinator, his special teams coordinator, other people he had worked with, if not at UNLV, then at other jobs, Arkansas, Memphis, places like that. He brought in a number of players from UNLV. Now, they weren't guys who had been, with the exception of maybe one, had been like all conference level players at UNLV. They were but veteran players, guys who've been on the field this year for him. I think, though, one part of it is, are you getting the best guys that you can bring, or are you just bringing the kind of guys that you'd be getting from the transfer portal anyway, filling out the roster? And then quarterback, like Curt Cignetti benefited from getting Curtis Work last year, from getting Fernando Mendoza this year, and those things didn't fall in his lap. That's an achievement that he went and got those guys. But I also think that if you're not getting, if your quarterback isn't at a certain level, then everybody else needs to be at a higher level, and neither of those things have been the case for Purdue on offense this season.
Let's talk about quarterback. I sat next to you, when you were sort of running me through a lot of kind of what has gone right and it has gone wrong for Purdue offensively this season at that Ohio State game. And then, you were among those that kind of pointed out how Purdue has been sort of using Ryan Brown. And now I guess, I don't know if it doesn't, correct me if I'm wrong, it does not seem like there's a quarterback controversy, but now there are at least questions about sort of like what the immediate and then long-term future of the position is. And, obviously it raises some eyebrows when you're asking the offensive coordinator in the last week of the regular season kind of what the quarterback situation is. But, I guess from your perspective, just how do you see Purdue stacking that up on Friday night? I know they've tried to do a few different things, tried to be a little bit more multiple at that position, which is kind of a strange thing to say. But I understand at least sort of what Purdue is trying to do at the quarterback position when I watch it. But from your perspective, kind of what does it look like this weekend? And maybe even more importantly, what does it look like long term?
Just to catch people up to speed, Ryan Brown has started every game this season. He was a guy who was here at Purdue last season. Technically, he's both a returnee and a transfer because he went to North Carolina for the spring, hung out with Bill Belichick for a while, and then transferred back, and has started every game this season. Malachi Singleton is a guy they brought in from Arkansas, and they have built-in packages for him throughout the year. They would use him around the goal line. They would use him in some other short yardage situations. Until the Washington game, when Ryan Brown started, went the first series of the game, and then Malachi Singleton came in and played the next 2 series of the game, and then they kind of alternated. into the second half, this game got out of hand pretty quickly. So after a while, Malachi Singleton played a lot of snaps because he just did the usual backup thing. But that's what led to the conversations we were having this week with Josh Henson and Barry Odom about where the quarterback situation stands. And I think if you're from a Purdue's perspective, that is a disappointment, I think, to get to the end of this season and not have more certainty at the quarterback position. Because if you go back to the spring, even before Ryan Brown got here, or certainly into preseason camp, you had both of those guys. You had Bennett Meredith, who had started a game a couple years ago and had been a backup in the program. You had another guy named Evans Chuba that they brought in from Washington State. All young guys, all with eligibility that they could build something together over the years. And you would have thought that you could get to the end of this season and maybe have some certainty about the most important position on the field. And I don't really think that's happened, obviously. The Washington game would tell you that hasn't happened. The way that they've talked about this coming game is that Brown is the starter. Brown will start. I would imagine you're going to see Malachi Singleton play. I had been asking for a couple of weeks heading into the Washington game just because of where performance had been. You know, Malachi Singleton came in, he led a touchdown drive at the end of the Ohio State game. Now, again, that's Ohio State's backups, but as we all know, Ohio State's backups are often as good as some first-string Big Ten defenses that they hadn't necessarily had a lot of success against earlier this season. And a number of things that kind of led to, hey, why not let Malachi Singleton go in and be real quarterback, like run the full offense, run a conventional quarterback look. And that's finally what they did at Washington. Brian Brown had done some good things earlier this year. I thought he was farther ahead as a football player than he was as a quarterback. I thought he was better at making football player decisions than he was at making quarterback decisions. That's not really that much of a criticism because I think making quarterback decisions is a much harder job. That's why those guys are so sought after. But he still has room to grow. He still needs to grow. They've had a receiving core that has let him down at times. His numbers should be better than they are. They've had one of the worst teams in the country in terms of drops. But he's also made bad decisions at times and thrown some interceptions and caused some and had some turnovers that have cost them. So they get to the end of this season in this game and being kind of stuck between needing to do what wins this game and also needing to really get a good look at both of these guys to give themselves something of a better picture of what they have going into the offseason. I also think, though, that there's no position on the field that Purdue shouldn't think it can upgrade through the transfer portal, or at least try. Quarterback might be the toughest one because those are the hardest guys to find. There's the most competition for the best guys at that position, and maybe they can't truly upgrade there. But I would imagine there's going to be somebody brought in. There's going to be attrition there, and there's going to be somebody they bring in from a competition standpoint. And at midseason, I thought there was reason to think maybe Ryan Brown is growing into something, but the performance has trailed off here at the end of the season, and Malachi Singleton has stepped up in some ways. And it's what I'm probably most interested in seeing on Friday. If you don't really think Purdue has a chance to compete and win this game, I want to see what these two guys do relative to each other, because it sets the stage for what could be some fascinating developments at that position.
I want to ask about run defense. It seems, at least again to the naked eye, like it's been a struggle for Purdue the last few weeks. They've allowed at least 170 yards rushing in each of their last 5 games. They've allowed 13 touchdowns in the last 4. I think over 1,000 yards allowed in the last 5 games. And as good as Fernando Mendoza's been, the constant for teams that just have not been able to run with Indiana, and I'm talking about Illinois, UCLA, Maryland, et cetera, those teams have just gotten gashed on the ground, and not necessarily right away. It's kind of a cumulative thing. That Indiana's running the ball better in the second quarter than it is the first quarter, and the third quarter than it is the second quarter, and it's rotating guys. And one of these games it's Roman Hemby, another it's Kalen Black, et cetera. But the constant is, if Indiana can run the football on you, then it is very difficult to slow them down. It's going to be cold on Friday night. We've all kind of done the math and wondered if this is the coldest weather Fernando Mendoza's ever thrown a football in, given that he's from Miami. Just kind of, where is Purdue's run defense, and do you think Purdue can at least make Indiana one-dimensional, or is this something that has, I guess the rushing totals last 5 games for opponents, 232, 184, 253, 170, 212. Is this something that has kind of become a little bit more, I guess, systemic at this point, Purdue really struggling to stop the run.
Yeah, I don't think they can make any good team one-dimensional. There's no evidence that they can do that. And the run defense hasn't necessarily been a bigger problem than the pass defense for most of the season. I can point to you some games. Luke Altmaier came in here for Illinois and just absolutely shredded them. Ethan Kaliakmanis came in and shredded them. And those are not the best quarterbacks in the Big Ten. They actually kind of held their own against Julian Sayin relative to some of those performances and what Sayin has done this year. But I do think that if your team can come in and run the ball well against Purdue, then it's probably going to have its way with the secondary eventually when Purdue has to adjust extra guys into the box or whatever to make up for that. Now, they do have, if I were to pick a strength of the team, and especially an emerging strength of the team long-term, it's probably the defensive line and the defensive interior. I think they have some intriguing young guys in there that in a year's time might be pushing towards being one of the better units in the Big Ten. And they've had some guys in the secondary who have played well. I would say Miles Slusher, a safety that has bounced around a little bit and played for Barry Odom before and came in this season. Taj Rael, a kid that came from Memphis. Like, they've had some stable things happening at safety this year. I don't think their cornerback play has been that good. Their linebackers are the guys who the coaches kind of point to for their leadership, Manny Powell, Charles Correa. And I think that's been true. But if you were to go look at, well, those stats you just rattled off, or even something more analytically based like the Pro Football Focus grades, which I think on any given game can be kind of wonky, but over the course of a season tend to tell you a story. Those grades aren't that good. There's a lot of missed tackles there. The play's not consistent enough. And that's really, I think Purdue, to compete in a game like this, it's going to be more on the offense. It's going to be more on the offense driving and finishing drives and keeping Indiana off the field as much as possible, because I just don't know that they are going to be able to. They've had some bend but don't break instances this season, but no instances where I feel like they've really come in and shut down an opponent.
I guess I wanted to ask, like, again, this is maybe a little bit more philosophical, but that Washington game, and I recognize going out of the West Coast is a little bit of a thing still for Big Ten teams. But, when I said it felt like earlier that it felt like Purdue's a better team, I mean, you could argue they gave USC a little bit of a game at the beginning of the year. I know, in the end they give up 43 and they lose, but like that Illinois game was tight for a while. You talked about Minnesota and Rutgers. They get shut out, but 19-0 is not maybe the same thing as some of the shutouts we were seeing put on Purdue last season. They, as you said, they probably should beat Michigan, or at least had a really good chance to. And even, if a 34-10 loss can seem competitive, like they didn't look just completely sort of checked out against Ohio State. And then they go to Washington, and that was the one where it seemed like the floor kind of gave in on this team in a way that I don't think, at least I had seen this year. Was that just, specific maybe to that game, that moment, what Washington's able to do to you, although I'm not sure if Jonah Coleman played in that game? Or is that maybe, listen, as a veteran of 2 0-10 high school football teams, you can feel like you're getting better, but at a certain point, like the weight of it does just kind of catch up to you at the end of the season. Do you think there's any of that maybe at this point with this team?
No, they were missing Coleman. They were also missing their really good receiver, Washington was, whose name is escaping me right now. Their top receiver.
Denzel Boston.
Yes, Boston. There was kind of a perfect storm maybe that week. I mean, we had thought that there was as much as you could show progress in a 34-10 loss to Ohio State, there still seemed to have been they had taken the step necessary to avoid just getting embarrassed. There were last season, there were many embarrassing losses. The worst one was 66-0, but there were other bad ones throughout the course of that season. And maybe even worse was the Notre Dame one at home, because it happened at home. And Notre Dame was coming off that Northern Illinois loss. Now, we found out later that Notre Dame was something more than that. But still, there were a lot of embarrassing losses last year. I didn't feel like there were any embarrassing losses this season until Washington. A couple of things happened in that game, or a couple of things were factors in that game. Number one, Ryan Walters is now the defensive coordinator at Washington. And that emotionally changed that game. And I don't think it really changed that game much from Purdue's perspective. It's a whole new roster, almost completely new roster. Certainly these coaches don't have like ill will towards Ryan Walters other than the hole that he left them to try to climb out of. Barry Odom had been Ryan Walters' boss at Missouri. So there was already some connections there in a more friendly way. But as far as the players on the field, I thought that there was an attitude from Washington players that Purdue then took the bait on, and it was their most undisciplined, immature game of the season. You had guys getting really stupid, unsportsmanlike penalties throughout the game, and it was just a mess. And it was their worst coached game of the year. I thought it was by far their worst performance just from a composure standpoint. And so I think that's the question for a team that has to show, like, listen, they still have to appeal to people in the transfer portal. As much as Purdue fans want to look at a team like Indiana and going out and getting Mendoza, or other teams that go out and like get these guys in the portal and say, well, Purdue needs to start spending. My response always is, you have to offer them more than money. Like, you have to offer them a non-miserable football experience. And that's why guys left after this past season. They all went to teams that were either had just been in the playoff or were headed there this year, or both. And they needed to show something at the end of the season to say this really is different. That yes, our record looks a lot like the year before's record, but something is happening here. And I thought Washington was a unquestionable step back in terms of that mission. And I think that gives them some extra incentive to find a way to compete in this game, at least into the fourth quarter. Like, make this a competitive loss if it has to be a loss. So I think if you go out and get just boat raced again, especially on your home field, then all these guys that you're trying to appeal to, especially the ones that have options to go to other winning programs. I mean, that's eventually what Purdue has to do. It has to start getting transfer portal guys who have the option of playing for other teams that are already winning and convincing them to come to Purdue. And I just think that's going to be harder if the last two items on your resume are you gave up 100 total points and weren't in either of these games competitively.
I'm trying to think of a delicate way to ask this, because I recognize what it sounds like coming from the IU beat writer on the IU podcast, etc. But I am curious, as we kind of steer this toward a close, where Purdue fans are with the rivalry at the moment. And of course, the flip side is we could probably have a not dissimilar conversation in reverse about basketball, of course. I mean, Mike Woodson, strangely, one of the few things that kind of went well for him in his tenure was he was competitive against Purdue. But the coach before him never beat Purdue. Clearly, and I guess I'm probably overcompensating at this point, trying not to sound too biased in one direction or the other, but clearly Purdue basketball is kind of, on top right now, and IU is chasing that on the hardwood. But in football and just kind of, as you talk about the dynamics of pointing maybe to programs like Indiana or others that have had some success doing what Purdue is trying to do in football, hire an experienced coach and then sort of empower them through the portal to kind of flip a roster and be competitive in the conference again. Like, there will always be that rivalry, obviously, like the cultural side of it, but is there a lot of trying to sort of use IU as a blueprint? Is there sort of a, hey, IU can't be our business right now, we've just got to focus on trying to get Purdue, football kind of back on track? Just where is this fan base with this rivalry? And, at the risk of going a little over the top, how do you think that will be reflected in terms of the color and scenery in the stands on Friday night?
Oh, I'm really intrigued to see what that's going to look like. How much red is in there? Does this look like an Ohio State game where they bring over a ton of fans? I'm very intrigued to see what that looks like, because regardless of what has happened here, results-wise, the last couple of years, the crowds have tended to still be fairly strong. I have seen some cracks in that in recent weeks, and it wouldn't shock me at all if there's a pretty substantial Indiana crowd in that stadium on Friday, especially compared to what it was back in the in the known history of college football for decades, where Indiana and Purdue there was always a separation there. And even, I was looking back through results last night, and I think it's been since like 87, 88 since Indiana has put like back-to-back comfortable wins on Purdue. Like there's never really been a time where it has like just so, at least in modern football, like so obviously owned the rivalry. And I think a lot of Purdue fans, they blamed last season on Ryan Walters, the administration, or whatever. They looked at what Curt Cignetti did in that first year, and I think it was a completely fair thing to say they're not a good team because of the schedule, but they're going to the playoff because of the schedule. They wouldn't have gone to the playoff with Purdue's schedule. I hope that's not a controversial thing to say, but I'm going to say it. But I think they also saw, okay, they had their moment. That was a great debut. And now Purdue will start to creep back up, and Indiana's going to have to like regress down to, something still good, but not like playoff caliber, right? Well, instead it went the other way. Like Indiana got even better and is doing even more impressive things and beating better teams. So I think where this, it's a tough spot, I think, for a coach to be in some ways. It reminds me, there are some parallels to my last job where I was covering Ohio State. And obviously I don't need to tell people what Ryan Day went through, losing to Michigan now, whatever it is, 4 years in a row. And obviously our conversations around that program, there was a lot of, what does this mean? A lot of, hair pulling over, that sort of thing. But it is also the context that Urban Meyer hardly ever had to play really good Michigan teams. And Ryan Day came in when Michigan became one of the best teams in the country again, under whatever circumstances. So I feel a little bit the same way for someone like Barry Odom, who comes in, and obviously the Purdue coach will and should be judged on how well he does in the bucket game rivalry. Like that's got to be one of the things that the coaches on either side of this, you've got to beat your rival. You have to at least be competitive in your rivalry. And last year Purdue was not. And right now they're a 28, 29 point underdog going into this game. So for Barry Odom, I do think there's a lot of like prerequisites that have to be taken care of before you can jump up and beat the number 2 team in the country. And they're obviously have not shown that they're there yet. But at the same time, it doesn't look like Indiana's going away. I think Indiana's going to be not just one of the best teams in the Big Ten, but maybe one of the best teams in the country now for the near future. And you have a long way to go to get back up to a place where you are a serious threat in that rivalry, I think. Maybe I'll be proven wrong on Friday, but it doesn't look that way on paper. And, I asked him directly, where does shrinking this gap fall in your priorities or how you look at your job? And he kind of talked around that and said there's a responsibility to win in the rivalry. But let's be honest, like it's a lot of guys when you're bringing in the transfer culture, these guys don't have the attachment to this rivalry that generations past did. And I think it's tougher at the end of a season where we've only won 2 games to make this special emotional appeal. The one way that I think that could come into effect is the guys who left UNLV or other places, but UNLV in particular, I think they're 9-2 right now going into their finale. They left behind a winning place to come here and get something started. And I think Friday is their last chance to push that in the right direction. And maybe that's some sort of motivation for them. But for fans, I think where I think the frustrations are that this season has only reinforced how far they fell last year. And I think I think it also reinforces something we tried to tell them going in, which is the Curt Cignetti Indiana thing is more the anomaly than it is the rule, even in this transfer era, that it's not easy to come in and just expect things to flip overnight from being kind of moribund to being not just one of the best teams in the country, but even a bowl team. And they've got a lot of work to do in finding more talent before they can start talking about being in the place that Purdue, that Indiana is in, for sure.
I guess just last question, and I'm not necessarily asking for a prediction, but more just kind of your read on this matchup. And we've talked about it, sort of statistically. We've talked about it schematically. We've talked about it philosophically. Just like, what do you think Friday night looks like? Is it a game where Indiana or where Purdue can maybe keep some things competitive, keep some things tight? Maybe put Indiana in some bother, maybe take advantage of the weather. Or is this, I think everyone would be surprised to see 66-0, but is this a game where you just think kind of the gap in quality maybe, tells pretty consistently across all four quarters?
Yeah, it's very hard to pick Purdue to win games like this, and because they just can't make any mistakes. I think if Purdue were to play a mistake-free game and force some turnovers, something they have gotten better at doing later in the season, and steal some extra possessions, and then actually be able to finish their possessions, like in addition to not being a team that moves the ball generally all that well, they're the worst red zone team in the Big Ten. It's just a bad combination. And if they were to like go out with their best performance, I mean, it wasn't that long ago. Like we saw them in Ann Arbor give Michigan everything it wanted. Like, Minnesota is not that bad of a team. They went on the road and almost should have beaten Minnesota. You mentioned like the Illinois game. Like I think at the end of that game, the win expectancy for Purdue, even at the end of a game they lost by that margin, was still like 25%. That if you were to take out the turnovers, that the actual play on the field was much closer than that. So like there's something here, but after the last thing we just saw at Washington, I think that's a big question, is like, can they get back to that place where they were playing a little bit more consistently, even if they couldn't jump up from a talent perspective and beat somebody? Or was that a turn? And will they not be able to get that back? I don't know exactly how to have much faith in that. My prediction was 40-13. I think Indiana should win pretty comfortably. Let's not forget everything Indiana has to play for, right? Like this certainly isn't a game. And that's one of the ways that things like the playoff have enhanced, I think, college football, is that it adds so much more meaning to every game. And I think that Indiana is in a historic place. It might be in. We'll see if they take the rivalryness of it into effect. I know that Curt Cignetti and Barry Odom had some exchanges in the offseason, not really directly to each other, but through people like us. So I don't know if that will be a factor on Friday or not. But I just think that everything Indiana has to play for, everything it has done to get to this point, I think they will take this seriously enough. And I think it helps Indiana that Purdue has been better this season, because Curt Cignetti could put performances up on the video board like side by side and say, hey, last year where that team looked like this is what it looks like this year. You guys have to take them seriously.
He's Nathan Baird. Nathan, thank you so much for joining Mind Your Banners. Sorry, there is more 7-year-old stomping of feet right outside my office door. That is the beauty of Thanksgiving break. But Nathan, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everyone who's listened to Mind Your Banners this week. Obviously, Mike and I will be with Nathan in I was about to call it sunny West Lafayette, and then I remembered it's a 7 p.m. kickoff. So it will not be sunny. But in West Lafayette on Friday for IU Purdue, who's just trying to wrap up their first ever 12-0 season and obviously guarantee themselves a place in the Big Ten Championship game a week later. For the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you soon.